Good morning. So I have to stand here. I live in Florida.
No, he didn't go to Greece. I know he didn't go to Greece. He's in under a tanning bed. Yeah, the secret's out. I thought I saw that.
All right, so
Sneaking out of there.
We have pictures, so don't deny it.
you know all this is on tape now. So and wave to the camera because you're on camera. In that row, you're on the camera. So
But they can't hear us.
well, my microphone's on, so they can hear you. And it's live, and it's on YouTube for everyone to see forever now, right? All right. Hey, how you doing? Sit in front of me so I can see you, huh?
Father, forgive me.
May the Lord forgive us both.
Do you want us to sit back?
Well, no, I mean, just it's easier. Don't worry, you're okay there.
I miss her when I
Well,
so I get to see
somebody misses you. See, I said that on tape too. See, you'll be able to show everyone how. I'm so mean to you. All right, so where did we leave off? Do you remember?
we were getting ready to start Luke.
The Gospel of Luke today, right?
And I brought my Bible last week and didn't bring it.
All right, so today we're going to talk a few minutes about the Gospel of Luke. And I want to start by reading the first words from the Gospel of Luke because this is going to give us a glimpse. Chapter 1, verse 1. Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. So St. Luke was a scientist. He was a doctor, right? And he also, you could say, he's sometimes called a historian. He also is the author of the book of Acts, by the way. So sometimes the Gospel of Luke is called part 1, and the book of Acts is called part 2, but we'll talk about the book of Acts in a few weeks. So here we are, but this is the reason I start with this is his opening. But I had the perfect knowledge of everything. So St. Luke, who was a disciple of St. Paul, traveled with St. Paul, and it says here, from the beginning, he had the eyewitnesses. So it's interesting because the church has always talked about those who were the eyewitnesses, those who were there from the beginning. So St. Luke says, look, others have written. We know the Gospel of Mark had already been written. Some think St. Luke used it. Most think St. Luke used it as a model for his information. But he now is speaking to a unique audience. He's speaking to the Gentiles. He's speaking to the world. So the Gospel of Luke is more in a historical context, almost written as if he's writing a history book. Okay, so he doesn't start with all of the ancestors of the Jews because he's not writing to them. He's writing to the people who could care less about the genealogy of the Jewish people. He's talking about the Messiah. He's talking about the Savior of the world. He's talking about someone who came for everyone. Okay, yes?
So he would make no references to the Old Testament.
I mean, he does, obviously, but his emphasis was not in showing that Christ was the fulfillment of the Old Testament because his audience are not the Jews. See, Matthew was really focusing on Christ as the Messiah of the Old Testament because the Jewish Christians understood what they were waiting for. And so we have now the Gospel of Luke is written for a totally different audience, a Gentile audience, really the Greek world. Okay? And he writes it almost scientifically. So he tends to be more precise in the way he tells stories.
It's easier, I think, to understand than some of the other books.
Ironically that you say that, his Greek is the most difficult.
I don't read Greek, so
Right?
it is.
But the reason it's so difficult is because he uses always the precise language, and so he uses, the Greek language is so precise, and they have a word for everything. And so because of his precision, it's actually more difficult to read in Greek, at least for me, because I'm not a native Greek speaker. But so that's his opening, right? He says, since they've already told the story, he says, but having had perfect understanding of all things from the first, which means he was there the whole time. Okay, he witnessed it all, and that's a really important thing for us. Right? Because we remember, when we get to the book of Acts, so we're going to remember that when the apostles were selecting successor apostles, one of the first criteria was, were they from the beginning? Were they there? Did they witness the entire thing? And so he is saying, I was here from the very first. Yes?
Was he then with the apostles before Paul?
Yeah, so this is one of the confusing things, right? So we think of the apostles, we think of the 12. He's not one of the 12. However, we forget that there was this big, huge entourage. There were hundreds of people that were traveling with them the whole time. It wasn't just 13 people. We forget about, when we read in the scriptures, there was the 12. There were dozens of other people involved. And we also see that when we see in the book of Acts, when they're replacing Matthias. And they say, well, who were the ones who were there from the beginning? And they list these 7 men. So they were also there from the beginning. But even in the gospel, it talks about the 70 apostles, the ones who Christ had sent out in advance even of the crucifixion. Right? So Luke is there for the beginning. Luke is an eyewitness to all of this stuff. Even though he was traveled with St. Paul, who was not one of the entourage. I mean, he was a Pharisee, right? But once Paul came into the picture, St. Luke traveled with him. So, and being a doctor, being a scientist of his day, he's much more precise in the way he's describing the story of Jesus Christ. And his audience is, of course, the entire world, not just the Jewish Christians. Okay? And in fact, if you were to look in your Orthodox study Bible, it talks about the universality of the gospel message, right? So some of the things that you're going to see in Luke's gospel is, for example, he talks about, again, almost like you're reading a history book. In the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias. So it's almost like you're reading a history book. All right? So that also gives us a nice glimpse into those details. And these details are historically relevant because you can look into the real history and you can see what year King Herod was the king. Right? And you can see all these different things. And so it helps us understand the message of the gospel. But the important one here is that it's for the entire world. His audience is not just the believing Jews. He's not just here to go from the Old Testament into the New Testament. In fact, he begins directly with New Testament stuff. He doesn't go all the way back into the past. And he talks about the incarnation of Christ. He talks about the Virgin Mary. He talks about, it begins with Christ's birth. Right? So he doesn't mess with all of that Old Testament stuff. When I say mess with it, you know what I'm talking about. He doesn't focus his attention on that stuff because the audience really doesn't have anything to do with all that. And it's an important thing for us. So the question for us is, when we are encountering people, where do we start with the story? right? And I think it really depends on who we're speaking with. I remember one time years ago, I just lost my page, you see that? I remember one time years ago, I encountered, during a Greek festival in Denver, I encountered a Muslim man who wanted to talk to me about the church. And so we began arguing, of course. But in that case, where did I start? I started with Abraham, because the Islamic people share that history, right? They're descendants of Ishmael, the other son of Abraham. So you can begin. So one of the things that it teaches us is, who's your audience? And that's why the church has different, I don't know if the word versions is the right word to use here when you're talking about the Gospels, right? Maybe different emphasis. Maybe emphasis is the better word. And so when we're thinking, who are we communicating with, right? So in our case, most of the people we encounter are Christians already. And they want to know what is the Orthodox Church, for example, right? And so the basis there is the Scriptures. The basis is, well, you're already a believer in Jesus Christ. Let's tell you maybe historically. And so maybe Luke would be a good place to start, or the book of Acts is where I normally start when talking to already believing Christians. Because Acts is a historical book. It talks about the original church. So St. Luke is doing nothing. Well, who's my audience? The audience are non-believers. The audience is all these other people out in the world. Let me tell them about this guy who came, God, who came to give life to the world. Right? He came to give life. Because whether or not they were Jews, whether or not they were believers, it is an innate human condition, I think, to not want to die. And so Luke says, look, I give you this message, how we can live forever, right? And he talks about how God came and he saves us from death. So that's the emphasis of the Gospel of Luke. I think it's a pretty good, it is the Gospel that we read in the fall. So I think I mentioned this before, that the Gospels are read at different seasons, right? So currently, after the Sunday of Holy Cross, we begin reading the Gospel of Luke all the way up until Christmas. And then it switches after Christmas. But for right now, we're reading from the Gospel of Luke. So all of these stories are preparing what? To receive God coming into the world. That's the emphasis, is God coming into the world. As we approach Great Lent, the emphasis changes. The emphasis is going to change, and we're going to be reading the Gospel of Mark, which is preparing. Remember what we said last time, that Mark talks about the sacrifice, right? And so the season leading up to Great Lent and leading up to Holy Week is the season of the Gospel of Mark. And we're going to read those stories because the emphasis there is on the sacrifice because of what Christ accomplishes during Holy Week. So all these things have their emphasis. Any questions about the Gospel of Luke?
I love the Gospel of Luke. I think it's so much easier to understand. It's as if they were missionaries going out through the world.
Yeah.
And you cannot teach it unless you understand the whole thing. So they were putting it into words so that others could believe it and hear it.
Yeah. And again, in that historical narrative. And I think in our day, we're used to hearing stories in that narrative. We're used to hearing that historical kind of context. Right.
With what was going on.
Right, yeah, right. Anything else? Any other thoughts? How are we doing on time?
We have 3 minutes.
We have 3 minutes. Okay, let's play Stump the Priest for 3 minutes. Who wants to try and stump the priest? You get one question. Yeah, you're a prayer. One question. Stump the priest. Anybody? All right, that's fine.
That's because we believe in you.
No, you don't want to embarrass me on the internet, that's what you don't want to do, right? See, Elena's going to ask me questions later. She doesn't want to embarrass me on the internet. All right, so that's it. So next week we'll talk about the Gospel of John. Today was Luke.
I thought we were going to continue in Luke for a while.
No, Matthew, Mark, Luke. Every Sunday's a different book.
No, I know. But I thought you were going to stay in Luke for a while.
No, no. So adult catechism is we're doing one book every week. Just the highlights, just the emphasis, just like a introduction to each book. So next week we'll do an introduction to the Gospel of John. And then we'll go to Acts, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll just make our way through the New Testament. That's 26 weeks. That'll get us through a few months worth of catechism, okay? No questions, last chance. All right, so we'll continue next week with the Gospel of John. We'll get ready for the second liturgy now. Father Theophany is doing the second liturgy. So I'm going to switch the camera and take care of that. Awesome, fantastic.
Thank you, Father.
God bless you.